Good morning and welcome to the In Defense of Christians Capitol Hill Advocacy Day, Day 2 of the IDC National Summit 2021. It's our honor to have you join us today. My name is Richard Gazelle, Executive Director at In Defense of Christians. We have an exciting program prepared for you today. Today's events will kick off with two expert discussion panels. The first one will kick off right now at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, and will focus on saving Lebanon as the last free bastion of Christianity in the Middle East and its challenges and way ahead. The second panel discussion will begin at 10 a.m. Eastern Time and will focus on Turkey, Ottoman fantasies, and geostrategic realities, particularly its persecution of Christians domestically and across international borders. During the panel discussion, I encourage you, our audience, both live and virtual, to have your questions ready for Q&A portion of the program. Those joining us virtually can submit their questions in the YouTube Live comments section, which we'll be monitoring throughout the program this morning. Following the conclusion of our panel discussions at 12 noon Eastern Time, all participants will gather into their pre-assigned groups for congressional advocacy meetings. We're pleased to report that IDC has secured advocacy meetings with upwards of 50 congressional offices for you, our close sponsors, supporters, and advocates. So without further ado, let's jump right in. As most of you know, for the last 2 years, Lebanon has been experiencing one of the worst economic crises in recent centuries. The economic crisis has now triggered a humanitarian crisis, further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the August 4th, 2020 explosion at the port of Beirut. What's worse, Hezbollah's stranglehold on Lebanese affairs vis-a-vis Iran has kept Lebanon on the brink of civil war and regional war for the last 4 decades, and enables the endemic government corruption we witness today. With us today to discuss the many facets of this issue, we have Bishop Gregory Mansour, the Eparch of the Maronite Catholic Eparchy of St. Maron of Brooklyn; Andrew Doran, co-founder of In Defense of Christians and a senior research fellow at the Philos Project; Ambassador Alberto Fernandez, joining us on Zoom, veteran U.S. diplomat and current vice president of the Middle East Media Institute Memory TV; and of course, last but certainly not least, Namna Tfram, resigned member of Lebanese Parliament. And joining us also via Zoom from Lebanon is Dr. Habib Malik, professor at the Lebanese American University and senior research fellow at the Philos Project. Welcome to you all.
Thank you.
Bishop Gregory, I'd like to start with you. Could you please talk to us about the role of Christianity, and particularly the Christian community in Lebanon, and the future challenges to Christianity in Lebanon?
Okay, it's a big topic. So I would like to see Lebanon as one of those rare nations that was formed by a Christian-Muslim intentionality. And I mean, which makes Lebanon a little bit different from all the other countries in the world. In the United States was created with an intention of a religiously free people, because you had people from all over the world who established the United States, and the first right is for religious freedom. And I think the same thing is true of Lebanon. Lebanon was created intentionally when Patriarch Hawaii, at the age of 76, traveled to Versailles to urge Allied leaders to carve out a nation that would be a refuge for Christians and Muslims. And he went there in a delegation of Christians and Muslims with the intention that Lebanon would have borders that would include Shiite, Sunni, Druze, and Christian. It bothers the heck out of me when I see anybody, including groups of people or individuals, who think that Lebanon should be just like any other nation. The majority rules and the Christian minority is not important, and et cetera, et cetera. So for me, Lebanon was created on purpose with a mission. And John Paul II said it very clearly in the 90s when he said, Lebanon is more than a country, it's a mission. And therefore, Christians and Muslims have an equal buy-in to that reality. And I can say this about some Christians, and I can say this about some Muslims. They think that history is not important, or the ideas of people in the creation of Lebanon are not important. And I beg to differ with them, whoever they are. And so I think that the role of Christians, the role of Lebanon in the world is so important, and it's worth not fighting and killing people for, but it's worth fighting to defend that identity of Lebanon.
Thank you, Bishop Mansour. Next, I'd like to go over to Andrew. Andrew, we understand you were just recently in Lebanon, spent some time on the ground there. Of course, the crisis in Lebanon has been very well known to you and many of us for years. But having just been there on the ground and spent some time there, your observations and study, what did you bring back with you?
Thank you, Rich. I think the first thing, like any traveler to a foreign country, you approach the question with a sense of humility. Lebanon can't really easily be understood by outsiders. I think there are dimensions to it that simply cannot be understood by outsiders. And so you spend years asking questions, listening, observing, thinking, asking more questions, trying to understand, and still you find these dimensions of Lebanon that are simply beyond comprehension. At the same time, outsiders can, I think, oftentimes offer perspectives and a little bit of objectivity and maybe a different angle on things. And so while I approach the question with humility, I nonetheless have some strong feelings on the subject. Two critical points that I think bear treatment. The first is that, after years of doing this in policymaking and advocacy, in some ways as a freelance journalist and traveling around the country and speaking with so many different Lebanese and people from the Middle East, one does begin to form some opinions. But we used to liken Lebanon to a complex physics equation, on a chalkboard. And you're looking at it, and one piece of data is off, or one part of one part of the problem is a little bit off, and it throws everything off. But you hear people say very often, well, Hezbollah is not the only problem. I think I would say that I understand that perspective, but that it is the sine qua non. It is the one problem that Iran's hegemony over parts of Lebanon, both geographically and institutionally. This is the one thing that if it is not addressed somehow, the other problems simply cannot be fixed. And I think that they are able to maintain power more or less for two interrelated and complex reasons. The first is the resistance narrative. Now, we've seen for the better part of 75 years that scapegoating isn't something that's new in the last 75 years, but the scapegoating of minorities, the scapegoating of foreigners, scapegoating America, scapegoating others. This has been more or less a governing tactic throughout the Middle East, and everywhere that it's been tried, it has failed. And so what we saw with the Abraham Accords last year, I think, was the trend that will continue in the region where there is success, and where that is not, some version of that is not tried, at least some sort of peace stability, something beyond like a temporary armistice. This is ultimately the path to peace and prosperity and stability. So anything that pokes a hole in not just the resistance narrative, but the governing through fear and terror and the constant threat and the ideology. Just a quick word on the ideology. The Khomeinist Hezbollah ideology. I was thinking of a story I heard from Mart Laar, the former Prime Minister of Estonia years ago, who grew up in communist-controlled Estonia. And he was going to get his PhD, and someone told him, well, you have to be a member of the Communist Party. And he said, well, I don't believe any of that. And he said, and the professor said to him, Mark, that's okay. Nobody has believed any of that for years. And so he enrolled in the Communist Party and got his PhD. In other words, everyone was sort of going through the motions of the ideology, but nobody believed it anymore. One gets the sense of that across the Middle East. When people are talking about the current crisis in Lebanon and its complex problems, its origins come from within Lebanon, and the parts that come from outside Lebanon come into Lebanon to subvert Lebanon's own interests and priorities. And they've been invited in from the inside. So Hezbollah has created a shadow military, a shadow government, a shadow economy, and they have learned how to benefit from every weakening of one of those institutions. So every time there is a failure of governance in Lebanon, every time the financial system or the economy is weakened, with every weakening of any sort of governing institution, they benefit. And so I think at some point there has to be an understanding that Hezbollah has essentially seceded from the Lebanon project. They have their own Lebanon. It's not a state within a state. They've effectively seceded. And so the question is, how does the rest of Lebanon, those portions of Lebanon that wish to be free, how do they unite under some sort of decentralized model and thereby put pressure on Iran and Hezbollah? Because Iran and Hezbollah want to drag the rest of Lebanon down. They benefit from this. They benefit from the exodus of Christians and other minorities. They benefit from the destruction of Lebanon's governing institutions. There's a reason that they're always trying to be photographed with the Lebanese armed forces, because they know that that will be used in Washington to defund the Lebanese armed forces. These are not foolish people. But they don't know how to lead. They don't know how to govern. All they know how to do is ultimately destroy. And this gets back to the first point, which is all of this is going to end in rubble and destruction. And whether it's people who were duped into ideology by fear or irretrievable stupidity or whatever it may be, it all ends the same way. And that's think Berlin 1945. If I may quickly, what are the steps that should be taken? I would say whether it's on a college campus or in the media or in policy-making rooms, I think confront the resistance myth in Lebanon. I think that's very important, because this is a very weak myth that can be taken apart. Secondly, when you see people who have the courage, whether it's the patriarch or the bishops or Druze villagers who stood up to Hezbollah, refused to be used as human shields, and had the courage to stand up, and we all saw those videos. And we saw how frightened those Hezbollah operatives were. Suddenly the tables turned in a matter of seconds because of the courage of those Druze villagers. That may be the model by which all of this comes crumbling down. It may be something very simple. It may be fragile. People say, well, they have 150,000 rockets. That's true. But I actually think they are more fragile than many people believe. I think that governance reforms ought to be instituted that lead to that isolation of Hezbollah. The Lebanese ought to be able to choose between a free Lebanon and a Hezbollah-controlled Lebanon. And then the last point I would just add quickly is that I would love to be able to say that the West is going to help, that America is going to help. Much of the history of Christianity in the Near East consists of Christians waiting, like those defending the walls of Constantinople, for help to come from the West that never comes. I don't think America is going to show up with a white paper that is going to solve Lebanon's problems. I don't think the West is going to show up and solve Lebanon's problems. And I understand that we're here, we're in Washington, and we are advocating for several specific things. And those are worth advocating for. But in the end, U.S. power in the Middle East is ultimately going to be limited. What the West can do in the Middle East is limited. And priorities are unfortunately going to be elsewhere. So in the end, the burden is going to fall with the people of Lebanon. And I don't say that in a cold way. I say that because I simply believe it. There are many more complicated issues, but you know, the Lebanese civil war is the war that the Christians lost twice, because they not only lost the civil war, but then were handed over to 15 years of Syrian occupation. My government had no small role in that. There are other instances of that. And so as we look at the news today, we look at grand bargains for peace being developed in the region. I'm sure many Lebanese are watching and wondering if they are once again going to be left to the wolves. So with that, I'll pass it over. You asked a very simple question and I gave too long a response, but thank you.
Never too long, Andrew. Thank you so much for that. And I certainly agree. You know, the founding myth, the narrative that Hezbollah has really propelled itself forward with is indeed a house built on sand. So it's important to capitalize on that fact. Thank you. Shifting over to Ambassador Fernandez. Ambassador, of course, we know you very well as an outspoken critic of Hezbollah for many years. My question for you, Ambassador, how do you view U.S. policy on Hezbollah? We know that it's not effective. I don't think that's really up for debate. But what can be done? Is it something that the U.S. government, in your opinion, is taking seriously? And what would you like them to know if you had their ear for a day?
Thank you for that. You know, it's a challenge. I agree with you certainly that I think U.S. policy towards Hezbollah has been schizophrenic. Somehow I got muted. I don't know.
We got you, Ambassador. We got you.
Okay. Yes, I think, you know, U.S. foreign policy towards Hezbollah has been schizophrenic, even in the best of times. And unfortunately, this has been a bipartisan schizophrenia, which existed even, for example, in the Trump administration, which was strongly against Iran and ostensibly strongly against Hezbollah. I mean, the problem is basically that we live in Washington this fiction that the subversion and occupation and dominance of the Lebanese state by Hezbollah is something which can be ignored or finessed. You know, by Washington, and that somehow we can separate the Lebanese reality from the reality of, you know, Iranian aggression in the region. Now, what I think Washington should do when it comes to Hezbollah and when it comes to Lebanon, I would say there's a couple of things. First of all, I want to say that, you know, ideally, a solution for Lebanon, unfortunately, which doesn't seem to be on the table, would be to have a Lebanon which was much more decentralized, which was much more federalized, where power was returned to local authorities, where you could really see where good governance functioned and where poor governance failed. Because I agree with Andrew that Hezbollah, in the end, really can't govern. It is a parasite on the Lebanese state, which is taking over and eating that parasite. Ideally, what should happen in Lebanon, obviously, is Hezbollah should be overthrown. It should be defeated. It should be crushed. That's not going to happen absent violence, and obviously, we don't need violence in Lebanon. In the United States, the U.S. doesn't have the ability, nor the foreign policy power, nor the attention to bring that about. And U.S. foreign policy track record on removing states and trying to change states and regimes, certainly in the last few years, has not been a very positive one. I think the U.S. needs to focus on several things. Number one, we need to look at Lebanese elections that are coming up in 2022. And even though I think expectations should be extremely low and realistic in Washington, the West needs to work to, at the very least, help those who are truly opposed to Hezbollah and its sectarian frontmen. both on the parliamentary level and later on when there's a an election, or there should be a selection of a new president. Again, the expectation I think is quite low. I think Washington needs to work in this area. The second thing which needs to happen is there needs to be a more grassroots effort to empower Lebanese outside the state and these organs and party institutions which are controlled by Hezbollah to kind of create a parallel society or counterculture away from the tentacles of officialdom that would be a step in the right direction. I hesitate to mention him because he's my friend and he was murdered, but in a way what we need is more what Lukman Salim, that martyr of Lebanese freedom who was murdered by, most likely by Hezbollah earlier this year, what he did, which is bringing together grassroots activists, business leaders, independents, anti-Hezbollah energy together and building these kind of grassroots networks. That needs to happen among the Lebanese Shia, people who are opposed to Hezbollah, who are independent, who have independent voices. And it also needs to happen among non-Shia, because one of the things that gives Hezbollah its power today, especially today, is the Christian cover that is given by certain political parties and certain politicians that basically make the Hezbollah project much more successful, much more encompassing than it would be. So I think that type of grassroots building and independent building very much on the local level among Lebanese Christians is essential. If we don't do that, what's going to happen very soon is the population of Lebanon, the Christian political representation in Lebanon will be exactly as it is, for example, in Iraq. As you know, in Iraq, there are parliamentary seats for Christians. The Christians that are chosen for these parliamentary seats in Iraq are not chosen by the Christians of Iraq. They're chosen by Shia political parties, very much like Hezbollah, or Kurdish political parties. They're tokens. They're basically front men for somebody else's political project. So those are the three things that I would focus on. Blunting the Hezbollah and its agents' agenda in the Lebanese elections, building on the grassroots level, both on the Shia side and on the Christian side. And on the Christian side, to basically decouple Mar Mikhail and other types of arrangements between Christians who somehow think that Hezbollah is the way to go, which actually are destroying the community and destroying the future of not just Lebanese Christians, but of an independent and unique Lebanon that is different than the other countries of the region.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that. I'd like to shift over at this time to Mr. Friend. Now, as many of you know, Mr. Friend is a resigned member of Lebanese Parliament, resigned shortly after the August 2020 explosion at the port of Beirut, which is attributed to government corruption and complicity in that tragic event. Nemat Efrem, in our opinion at IDC, is one of the few truly reform-minded members of parliament, former members of parliament. So I'd like to pose the question to you, Nemat. After 13 months of there being no government in Lebanon, one was recently announced about 2 weeks ago. Your thoughts?
Well, thank you. First of all, I would like to comment what I've heard from the three speakers. Really, they complement the picture, and now I think the view is a bit clearer. So what we have today is a new government. I don't want to shoot from the beginning and say that it's going to be the same thing a different day, and it's going to be in kicking the can. So I would say, let's wait and give it a chance for 2 months, really 2 months, to see how, first, this government will deal with the IMF, because this is where the rubber meets the road. Will they know how to take structural decisions that are not necessarily popular decisions for the next election, that will help Lebanon go back to track. Two, they will know how to deal with the decision-making processes within the government vis-a-vis Hezbollah and others. And all of these will be very clear in the coming 2 months. Now, if I want to go back to really the problem of Lebanon, well, I guess what we are having is a situation which is very, very special after we have lost the war in 90. Somebody said it, I don't know who, probably Andrew. And after that, we could see how with time, Lebanon is starting to be excavated from inside to such an extent that in 2019, it crumbled. This is really what was happening. 20 years of a termite-like work from inside to such an extent that it collapsed, but collapsed a multidimensional collapse, a political, administrative, economical, and social, all together. And since we are here in IDC, in defense of Christian, and we are talking about the last bastion of Christianity in the Middle East, I would say first, this is the last bastion of Christianity in the Holy Land. It's beyond the Middle East. This is the Holy Land. And we are talking about an exodus. I warned about it 2 years ago at IDC when I said it's more lethal, it's more effective to take out the Christians from the Middle East by having a failed state in Lebanon than by having persecution of Daesh. It's even more dangerous, more effective, not because it is going straight to every family, it's because also it's silent. It's a silent killer. What's happening now in the last 6 months, we haven't seen it in 20 years of civil war. When you see that you don't have Panadol, antibiotics in the pharmacies of Lebanon, when you cannot have oxygen in the hospitals, the Lebanese that are used to be living at $12,000 GDP per capita, surrounded by economies of $500 to $1,000 GDP per capita. They cannot accept to stay in an economy of $2,000 or $3,000 GDP per capita. It's as simple as that. And they are leaving. And in 3 years, we will be talking about 200,000 Christians in Lebanon. This is alarming. This will change forever Lebanon. As Bishop Mansour said, Lebanon was created for those pillars or constituents of Lebanon today, the families, the sectarian families, the Maronite, the Christians, the Muslims, the Druze, the Shia, and the Sunni. If the Lebanese, one of them disappear, like today the Christians, we will be talking about the raison d'etre of Lebanon. And Lebanon will change forever. This is why we need to act now, and this is why we are talking about, we're having this session today. The problem is, and unlike with what's happening with Daesh in Iraq or in Syria, here we don't solve the problem with one-dimension solution. It's more complicated because it's a social, economic, governmental, governance, and administrative problem. You need to deal with it in those 4 dimensions. This is why we think that the problem is a failed state problem because it has been excavated from inside and destroyed from inside, that we have to rebuild at those levels. This is why the solution needs to be addressed from how do we rebuild Lebanon governance, decision-making process, administration, all of these things together. Starting from one point, we need to have Lebanese that believes that Lebanon needs to go back to be a free, functioning, productive country. All of these together. Our objective should bring us back to the $12, $15, $20,000 GDP per capita. Otherwise, you cannot have Lebanese educated, successful, all of these Lebanese staying in Lebanon. This is why we have created, since I left Parliament, we have created a new movement. And we called it Project Homeland, Project Watan, because we felt that it's a new project. We have to rebuild it. From there, we decided that we need to answer 8 questions, 8 structural questions if you want to rebuild a functioning Lebanon. And I want to list them very quickly. The first one is, what do we mean by a civil state in Lebanon? Everybody's talking about a civil state. It's an oversimplification of things to say it's a normal secular democracy where everybody, where the majority takes a toll, and then it doesn't work like this. We are talking about Lebanon, about the Middle East, where the religions, the monotheistic religions came on earth. This is a place where sectarianism is an identity issue. It's not going to church. It's beyond. So second is decentralization, extreme decentralization. How do we mean by it? How do we do it? 3, what do we mean by the national security of Lebanon? And 4, what is the ultimate electoral law? 5 is the independence of judiciary. 6 is the socio-economic identity of Lebanon. How free economy it is, how the economy is, how free it is, or how social it is. Because we have another problem coming with what's happening. The change of the DNA of Lebanon is being replaced by a Venezuelan-like today economy. Very similar. It can't be more similar than that today. And last but not least, the recovery plan from this collapse, economic collapse. So all of this, I don't want to continue further, but I tell you, we have to work very hard in this new election to have a plan to go to a functioning, free, productive Lebanon. Otherwise, there will be no more Lebanon that looks like us here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Your insights are certainly valued. Shifting over to Professor Malik, my question for you, Professor. You're a prolific writer, specifically on the matter of federalism in Lebanon. Now, the issue of federalism is it's an idea that's shared somewhat widely, but not very frequently spoken, frankly and directly about. And there are also some misconceptions. Some folks tend to view federalism in Lebanon as this idea of Balkanization of Lebanon, but we understand that's not exactly what it is. So could you please talk to us a bit about this idea of federalism in Lebanon, Professor?
Thank you, Rich, and I thank IDC for making my presence with you, audio presence, not video, possible today. Yeah, I'll say a few words about federalism, but I want to, in a sense, I regard the federal option, if you will, as Plan B, because right now I am taking quite seriously the upcoming elections next May, and it's pretty obvious that a grassroots opposition to this mafia militia cartel that has seized Lebanon, this grassroots opposition has emerged, and it went in large numbers into the streets starting in October 2019 to protest the defrauding of the Lebanese people, the decades of corruption and mismanagement, and the criminal politician warlords. Now, most of those protests, very large scale, were peaceful. Indeed, they were civilized, but they were met with violence and the use of escalating force by the authorities and those protecting them. This is a clear example of oppressors and oppressed. Lately, this same opposition has been organizing itself into a variety of populist groups with a view to challenging the powers that be of the cartel in next May's appointed parliamentary elections in Lebanon. And of course, sitting with us here is maybe the leading figure in this opposition, Mr. Namat Frem, who in a sense, very briefly outlined some of his program. And I happen to know some of the details, and there's a lot of substance behind what we are going to be seeing during the upcoming elections. I agree with Ambassador Fernandez that we shouldn't have very high hopes for these elections, because the cartel in charge has all sorts of tricks up its sleeve in terms of fraud and buying of votes, and of course, at the end, scuttling the elections altogether and creating a security pretext. But look, a great deal is at stake. Nothing less than the future of an entire generation of young Lebanese, Lebanon's own future. Lebanon is losing its youth to galloping emigration. And this will mean the end of Lebanon as we have known it. An oasis of personal and communal freedoms in an otherwise freedom-starved Middle East. Lebanon losing its Christian youth primarily, along with entire Christian families, packing and leaving permanently, will render Lebanon indistinguishable from its Arab surroundings in terms of the absence of basic freedoms and pluralist coexistence. Well, over the past several months, the criminal cartel has seen to it that the bare necessities of daily life, essential medications, electric power, gasoline, diesel oil, running water, the internet, have been reduced to near vanishing levels, thereby transforming people's lives into a daily hellish pursuit after scraps of these vital items, often with no results. How much longer will the punishment of an entire people persist as the rest of the world watches, or more likely averts its gaze? So what can realistically be done? And again, Rich, I'm still addressing the contours of Plan A. Plan B would be if the elections fail or don't happen or are scuttled, or then of course a federal option is the only viable one for any composite or heterogeneous society like that of Lebanon. Realistically, I think the opposition born of Lebanon's still pulsating civil society and spread across sectarian divides needs to be given a fighting chance to compete on as level a playing field as possible in the upcoming parliamentary elections next May. For this to happen, connections with this opposition by external powers friendly to Lebanon need to be strengthened, with tangible support and publicity being provided. On the spectrum of options available to friendly Western powers, the two opposite poles of this spectrum should be avoided. On one end, attempts at nation building, which under the best of circumstances tends to be a fool's errand. On the other hand, cutting and running, that is total abandonment, which is both shameful and unbecoming of American and the West's sustained, unique cultural, political, and geostrategic footprint in Lebanon after close to 2 centuries. A footprint that has brought countless benefits to both Lebanon and the wider Arab region. Smart and creative steps along the spectrum of options between these two toxic poles are what is required. Washington's policy planners can do better than to shrug cynically and say, let it fail, or these are tribes, they'll elect the same crooks, or give it to Syria, and so on. Specifically, helping to salvage what has positively distinguished Lebanon for decades, if not centuries, namely education grounded in free critical inquiry, first-class healthcare, a vibrant, largely successful mercantile culture premised on free enterprise, innovation, and private property ownership. These are the areas where the West has invested heavily in the past and must not abandon today. When America knew how to do benevolent empire, no land grabs or imperial colonial impositions as with other powers, the legacy and face of the principled American shone through and imprinted itself indelibly among generations of Lebanese and by extension Arabs. No reason to squander all of this now. The Lebanese can rebuild their own nation if the cartel monkey, especially the mafia component of it, is lifted off their backs. Serious and intricate election monitoring by the West and the international community's credible agencies needs to be undertaken, from the electoral law to ballot counting and everything in between. This will serve as a weapon in the face of irregularities or widespread electoral fraud at the hands of the cartel. Nullifying internationally counterfeit elections will deal a strong blow to the perpetrators. Slapping harsh, targeted sanctions on specific individuals and groups will bring about another blow. So far, not a single member of the criminal mafia in Lebanon has been brought to justice. What a deplorable stain. Creating an international fund under the stewardship of high-profile, morally impeccable individuals, a fund for Lebanon's and especially its Christian future generations, and publicizing it widely will inspire trust and confidence in potential donors, especially among the Lebanese diaspora, and help to stem the hemorrhage of emigration currently underway. Many families, particularly Christians, will have second thoughts about leaving if they can be reasonably assured that their children will be able to have access to affordable education and health care in the coming years. For the moment, in parallel with election support for the opposition, a squeeze on the mafia, continued support for the Lebanese army, and setting up the fund just mentioned, swift attention must be seriously given to providing relief on the level of the absent daily necessities that the suffering Lebanese people are deprived of. Better that this be done directly and not through mafia-infested government channels. Again, creative humanitarianism is required. Writing Lebanon off as a lost cause is way too premature and in fact self-defeating for the West. Bold, clever, and cost-free moves can be done to help alleviate the mounting pressures on Lebanese society and to create a viable opening for the opposition forces to assert themselves at the ballot box come next spring. Freedom is Lebanon's gift to the region. Do not forsake it. Now, again, we give this Plan A one last historic chance for the elections in May. If it doesn't work, I am an advocate of the federal option, as Ambassador Fernandez has outlined, and we can go into tremendous detail on that, but maybe at the right time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for that detailed answer. I'd like to now open it up for questions. We have a number of questions queued up from our virtual audience, but if anyone in our live audience has any questions, please raise your hand to be recognized. We have a microphone floating around. I think we have.
Hello? Oh. I just have a question. Israel has not come up, but is there any role for Israel to play in relationship to this future of Lebanon?
Thank you so much. And if you could just identify yourself for the audience and for the panel.
With Charisma Magazine.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think this is a good one for you, Andrew. Any role in the future between Israel and Lebanon, outlook on normalization? We've seen Abraham Accords unfold over the last year. Unfortunately, none of them included Lebanon. Thoughts on that?
Thank you, and thank you for the question. I actually, probably one of the few Americans who has a little bit of experience firsthand in both places in the last couple of months. And what really strikes me is that setting governments aside, there's immense fascination from people in each country in the other country, and I think a lot of misconceptions, which I find to be very interesting. And I would also say that the overwhelming majority of both people in both countries, I think, want peace. My sense, and obviously I can't speak for the Israelis, but my sense is that the Israelis are about as keen to send their young men and women in the military back into Lebanon as Americans are to send troops back into Afghanistan. That was their Afghanistan. They withdrew in 2000, and they've ceded everything except Sheba Farms. And so the rationale for military resistance that Hezbollah offered, with the exception of Sheba Farms, which is frankly complicated, probably Syria has the best claim to it, doesn't exist anymore, and yet they've continued a military buildup. So Israel looks to the north, and all they see is Hezbollah. So when you try to explain to Israelis that it's much more complicated, I think that they're a little bit, they're somewhat skeptical because they see a country that's more or less held hostage. At the same time, you saw during the terrible port blast, the Lebanese flag shown on buildings in Tel Aviv as a sign of goodwill. I think they would love nothing more than to have peace, but they've been burned so many times. I think their approach has been typically to hands off. They don't want to be involved. They will speak to anyone, but they don't want to be. They know that they are very easily a pretext for violence either against individuals or a military conflict. Having said that, they are very close to 150,000 rockets that are aimed at them. And that's a very difficult situation for them. So what role? I simply don't know. I suspect that they would welcome any sort of opportunity for creative diplomacy, but they're very pragmatic at the same time. So I don't know if that really answers your questions, but I think they would say, we don't want to be involved, we just want to be left alone. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Anyone else in the audience live? Yes, Elan.
Good morning, everyone. Great conversation. It's a question for the virtual friend, Alberto Fernandez. Ambassador, how are you? This is Alan Dargham. How are you, sir? So let's talk about the tools of sanctions. As we living in Lebanon, we witness that sanctions only serve the interests of Hezbollah instead of limit its activity or whatsoever. And we see the deterioration of the Lebanese economy. It's also serving Hezbollah that he create his own economy inside Lebanon. And we see this big shift between Trump's administration to Biden's. We see different interests in the region, different way of seeing how they're going to achieve the same goal probably, but the Biden administration, or the feeling that we sense in Lebanon, that he is not very interested in what's really going on in Lebanon. Maybe now we hear congressmen speaking greatly about Lebanon, but when it comes to real policies by the Biden administration, it's absent, completely absent now. What's your take on that?
Is that for me? Yes. Yeah. Look, I'm not a fan of Biden administration, so I'm not going to parse or try to present them in a good light. I think that the approach with Iran, which comes, the approach towards Iran, towards coming to some kind of deal with Iran, is going to benefit Hezbollah. It's going to benefit all of Iran's proxies and allies and entities in the region. So I have very low expectations from the Biden administration when it comes to the region and to Lebanon, unfortunately. I would hope that some of the common sense things which have been said, like a focus on positive outcomes in the electoral process, understanding basically the as Dr. Habib calls it, the cartel and Hezbollah, which is part of that cartel, seeking to undermine Lebanese remaining political processes. We need to compete. I think there's a larger problem beyond the U.S., and that is the way that the West looks at Lebanon is flawed, in that Lebanon is important, Lebanon is unique, but all too often, foreigners, foreign states, including the United States, fall into the default of thinking that Lebanon is this, these corrupt state entities or these corrupt plutocrats that are there. And the country is not the same as these people who are looting it and robbing it. So I think that the West needs to have a kind of a deeper perspective when it has to Lebanon as a nation and as a people, engaging but being less naive in how they're doing it, and less naive when it comes to Hezbollah. I think there needs to be more sanctions on Lebanon, not on Lebanon, but in Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah stooges and enablers, particularly those who are not actually members of Hezbollah, but actually are people who give it cover, political cover, and economic cover. Magnitsky is something which needs to be used more in Lebanon. Of course, that is targeted. That is not on the Lebanese people as a whole. That's targeting corrupt individuals who are the ones, by the way, responsible for the disastrous situation which Lebanon finds itself today anyway.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Unfortunately, we've run up to the end of our time. What a wonderful discussion to have that could go on for hours. But I do have one last question that I'd like to pose for Bishop Gregory, and that has to do with Christian institutions in Lebanon. We know that for the last 100 years, Christian institutions, hospitals, schools have really been a backbone for Lebanon, not just the Christian community, but for the Lebanese state as a whole. Briefly, Bishop Gregory, could you just talk to us about the role they find themselves in today and what we can do to help?
Thank you, Rich. And thank you for this panel. Thank you for everyone for being here and those who are watching online. I cannot overemphasize how important Catholic institutions are in Lebanon. Without them, the government has been zero. And if you want to serve the poor in Lebanon, help the Catholic institutions, because they help Catholics, they help Orthodox, they help evangelicals, they help Shiite and Sunni and Druze. Now, with that, if I can just conclude with some thought. In human history, there has been 3 places in which Christians, Muslims, and Jews have thrived. Andalusian Spain, and that's history. Isfahan, Iran, and now that's history. Lebanon is left. The only place now on earth where there is a Christian-Muslim conviviality. That is why it bothers the heck out of me. This is my issue with Hezbollah, and my issue also with others, who doesn't buy in to the very history and identity of Lebanon. If you don't get Lebanon, it's just like any other place on earth, and just let it fall to the cartels. But if you get Lebanon, then you will conform yourself to that Lebanon that is part of history and that is part of a conviviality that might not be there tomorrow if you don't help the Catholic institutions of Lebanon, for instance, or if you don't diminish some of Hezbollah's arm on Hezbollah and Iran's arm on Lebanon, but also with Saudi Arabia. We don't want a Lebanon that looks like Saudi Arabia or looks like Iran. We want a Lebanon that looks like it was intended to be, and that is Lebanon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Bishop Mansour. And thank you to all of our panelists that are joining us today. And a special thanks to our participants, both live here in the audience, as well as those joining us virtually. This concludes our first panel. We'll take a brief intermission of about 5 minutes and resume with our second panel discussion to begin at about, we'll say about 10:10. But you're welcome to join us for some refreshments outside. Thank you.